morning. Thank you very much. So where's the guy that shot 130? I just want to know, because I want to play. Oh, I would like to play with 126. Oh, that's a different story, yeah. So I would like to play golf with you next time, because I'll feel good about my game. I'm glad. I love Jeremy and his talk, and now you know why Paul Krugman is my favorite comedian. He's okay as an economist, but as a comedian, he's fantastic. Do you guys read him in the New York Times? I love his vigor. So I also have a question. I've never in my life worn a red shirt, and I bought one. And I don't think so. Okay? So you say that because you're standing here in front of me and you have no choice. And this is really what I'm going to talk about today, is about the data that we get and what's reliable. Because you're not going to lie to me to my face, and you're not going to let me drown in a pool of silence about how ugly this red shirt is, which I believe it is now that I saw it out of the box. But it was the only one I had, so I made the choice and I'm sticking with it. But here's how I'd like to begin. I know what you guys do, and it's impressive. And I thought in order to just sort of set proper expectations for what you're going to hear from me for the next hour, i.e. lower the bar a little bit, I'm going to tell you how I spend my days, because I know how you spend your days. So this is how I spend my days. I live in New York. How many here are from New York? I'm just curious. Yeah, okay. So I wake up. I live on the Upper West Side. I'm lucky enough to have an office that's out of my home, so it's about 2 blocks away, so that's my commute. And on my walk, I just kind of start to think about stuff and the people I see and what people are doing and what's happening and transportation and weather and blah, blah, blah. And then I get to my office and I make some more coffee, and then I sit down and I just kind of keep thinking some more. And I spend the day just thinking and reading and writing, and it is unbelievably unexciting, and compared to what you guys do, unbelievably, I believe, unimpressive in a lot of ways, because here's the kind of things that I spend my days thinking about. So I like economics, I like psychology, I like golf, I like a lot of things, but economics, I never really liked the classic, especially macroeconomics, because it's boring. And it doesn't seem that important, and most economic predictions about the future, and even most descriptions about the past, are just wrong. Economics is the macroeconomy is a really hard thing to understand because there's so many moving parts. But I like parts of economics. I like microeconomics, and I like where it intersects with other things that are interesting to us, like psychology and sociology and so on. But I read some economics journals, and I kind of like agricultural economics. I grew up in upstate New York on a farm. I went to college in the mountains of North Carolina, just north of here in Boone, North Carolina. So I like nature. I like how, think about how the food supply works. And I was reading this agricultural economics journal, and I just saw this one statistic that surprised me. And this is how a lot of things start. And the statistic said, it was talking about the share of turkeys that are bred for consumption in the United States, and what share of them are produced as a result of artificial insemination, as opposed to turkeys breeding naturally. And the number was like 99.9%. So I thought, okay, gross, kind of. You don't want to picture how that happens necessarily, but interesting, right? I mean, I never thought about turkey breeding, and I never would have thought that all the turkeys that we eat are the product of turkeys that are produced by artificial insemination. And so when you see a number that strikes you as curious or an outlier in some sense, what you do is you immediately try to surround it. You try to put it in some context, right? You try to compare it to other things that you might know about or try to figure out what's going on there. So what do? You immediately go, in this case, I immediately went to the chicken breeding data, right? You figure turkeys, chickens, pretty similar, we eat them. And then you go look up the chicken breeding data, and it turns out that the vast majority of chickens that are bred for consumption are not the result of artificial insemination. That most chickens breed as, nature intended. So what's the story with the turkeys, I wanted to know? Natural question, right? I'm sure you guys think about turkey sex as well on a regular basis. And so, you go looking for further data, and you go talking to people who do this, to breeders and to people who sell the product and so on. And so here's the story that I found out. Americans have eaten an increasing amount of turkey over the past 50 years. It used to be almost none, and now between turkey and chicken, we're almost catching up to red meat. And as a result, interestingly, the price has risen, not fallen. So demand and supply often work in ways that are not obvious at the outset. But Americans particularly love the white meat of turkeys. Okay, so when we roast a turkey for the holidays, but also when we eat it for turkey sandwiches, we really, 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 really like the white meat, which I believe is it really has to do with, it's a better delivery system for gravy and for mayonnaise than dark meat, and that's what we're really after. But anyway, there's this huge preference for white meat. So breast meat. So what do? Well, as it turns out, the breeders and people who raise and sell and make their money from selling turkey responded to this preference, and they began to breed turkeys with larger breasts over time. So if you go back and look at the turkeys that were bred for consumption 50 years ago, they were kind of like wild turkeys, kind of scrawny, kind of big bottoms and very scrawny breasts. But as they bred them to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger breasts, you can imagine. So like now it's gotten to the point where like the male turkeys have these big breasts and the female turkeys have these big breasts, and literally when they would meet in the farmyard, however I don't know how they meet up, but when they would meet, they're like this, and their breasts are so big that they literally cannot reach each other to naturally procreate. Thus, the birth of a cottage industry, which is artificial insemination in turkey breeding, okay? This is how I spend my days. you know. That's example one. I'll give you another example. Like I said, I walk to work usually in New York, and you know, I live on, like I said, on the Upper West Side near a pretty busy intersection where there's cars and bikes and pedestrians and people going to the park with dogs on leashes and babies and strollers, and it's really chaos. And on the one hand, I think this is an amazing illustration of how what's called hidden order. Sometimes it's called rinkonomics, like a skating rink. Like the idea is like, can you imagine if you came up with this idea today that we are going to start a business where you take a bunch of people who are not trained experts at all and give them these shoes with really sharp metal blades on the bottom, and we're going to put them on a big sheet of ice and let them just go out and run around on their skates, on these skates, right? And just kind of let them regulate themselves. And if you tried to invent this business today, it'd be totally impossible, because everybody would say, oh my God, they'll be killing each other, they'll be attacking each other, and so on. The insurance will be impossible. But it turns out that people do that all the time in skating rinks. It works. Why does it work? Because of what's called, like I said, rinkonomics or hidden order, which is that if you create an environment where people can kind of use common sense for the most part, they do. And of course you need to regulate and tweak and use prices, but I look at these intersections where I live, and it's remarkable that there aren't like 100 people getting run over every day. It's remarkable to me, and yet they don't. That said, people do die all the time in traffic fatalities. And this is an interesting topic to me, because whenever we think about behaviors that we do in society, particularly risky behaviors, we get really, really, really agitated, and these calls to arms to regulate or stop or police these activities where someone gets hurt or killed when we think it shouldn't happen. So, you know, if you're walking out of this hotel later today and a piece of the roof collapses, right, God forbid, and it falls down and hits somebody on the head and kills them, you know that within a year in the North Carolina state legislature, there's going to be new regulations about how roofs are built and regulated and policed and so on. That's just kind of the way we respond to things. And yet driving is one of these things that, in part because it's been around for a long time, we kind of have this huge cost, and yet accept it as part of the cost, as part of the benefit of getting to drive. So driving is awesome. It changed America. It changed the world. And yet about 33,000 people die every year in US traffic fatalities. So that's a lot of people. That's more people than are killed each year in homicide and suicides combined, okay? So more people drive in traffic fatalities. Suicides rarely make the newspaper. Most homicides make the newspaper. Traffic fatalities, they're kind of, you know, we see them so often, they get reported on, but they're just not dramatic enough to really capture our attention. And so we just kind of think about them as, like I said, the cost of driving. And I guess that's kind of fine, but at the same time, I also sort of hate it. I hate that, you know, we accept that toll without working even harder to get it down. Now, the fact is, we have worked really hard to get it down. The US government, which is not necessarily my favorite institution in the world, I mean, I think it does some things really well, but others not that well. The US government has done an amazing job of helping all of us bring down traffic fatalities through all kinds of regulations, but also encouraging innovation, encouraging R&D, and so on. And so even though the number of traffic fatalities every year is still relatively high, about 33 to 35,000, the rate of fatalities has fallen a ton because the number of miles driven has risen so much. So in some way, we're safer per mile driven by a long shot. So that said, I like to look at, how do people die or get injured in traffic fatalities, and what are the levers that we should be pushing, whether it's policy or penalizing people, whatnot. And it turns out that there's one that really, really stands out, which is drunk driving. Even though we've been preaching about it for a lot of years, and we know that it's a really bad thing to do, it is still unbelievably dangerous, and it contributes a huge part to traffic fatalities. So I think somewhere between 35 and 40% of all fatal traffic accidents involve a drunk driver, right? So if you remove just drunk driving, you'd immediately cut your deaths and injuries and cost and lost productivity and all that, on and on and on, billions of dollars. You'd cut it by a ton. Now, we've done a lot to do it, and we've gotten somewhat better, but the fact is that if you look at the data on how much drunk driving there is and how often it is penalized, you see that we don't really take it as seriously as we think we do. So it turns out, if you look at the data, that if I'm driving drunk, I can drive about 30,000 miles before I can reasonably be expected to be pulled over and arrested for drunk driving, right? So I could drive from New York to LA and back 5 round trips, right? Before I could reasonably be expected to be pulled over for drunk driving. Now, if we really wanted to stop drunk driving, we could. We know how to introduce penalties in public life and society. We could set up a roadblock every mile on every road in America, right? And monitor for drunk drivers. And when you find one, you take them out of their car and you shoot them on the spot, right? And that would stop drunk driving, I promise you. Now, as a society, we think that's too high a price to pay, right? Every benefit has a cost, and that cost is too high. But I'm just describing the problem that we've looked at and tried to think, what are the ways to try to help more people, not do stupid things and help more people not get hurt or killed by other people doing stupid things, right? So then we were looking at these data. We had a thought. Again, like I said, I live in New York. I walk all the time. And my kids are now 14 and 13. You try to teach them to walk the streets, and not walk the streets in the you look at the data and you look at how dangerous it seems to be walking around, and you look at pedestrian fatalities, and those are a pretty substantial part, and those have actually risen a lot more. And then I got to thinking, we know that drunk driving is really dangerous, but what about drunk walking? Right? Has anybody ever looked at that? Because more and more of us live in cities today than ever before. There's a greater share of humankind in cities today than ever, which, by the way, was exactly opposite all the experts' predictions many years ago. And so you've got a lot of people who don't even own cars, don't need to own cars, and they go out and they eat and drink and they do whatever, and then they got to walk somewhere. They might decide to walk home, or they're just walking for a taxi, and we want to know, what's the risk for them? Because as far as we could tell, nobody had ever looked at it, even though there was a lot of data on drunk driving. So we went looking for data on drunk walking, and it turns out that the US government, even though it's very good on traffic statistics, did not have any good walking statistics and no drunk walking statistics at all. So we had to kind of cobble it together and make some assumptions and build a kind of scenario where you can measure what the actual risk is. So here's the scenario we envisioned. Let's say you go to a friend's house. Let's say you live in Asheville, and you have a friend who lives a mile away, and you drive to the friend's house for a barbecue, and then there's really good beer or whatever there, and you have a few more than you planned on, and then you decide, I really shouldn't be driving, and I know about the drunk driving danger, so I'm going to do the smart thing. I'm not going to drive home. I'm going to leave my car here with my friend overnight, and it's only a mile. I'll just walk home. So what is the relative danger of driving home drunk versus walking home drunk? So that's the calculation we wanted to do. And when you look at those data, here's what you find. If my only two choices are drive drunk and walk drunk. It turns out that I'm 8 times more likely to die walking drunk 1 mile than driving drunk 1 mile, okay? And the way that you can get, now the good news about walking drunk is that you're not gonna kill anybody else. So driving drunk you can and may, so that's the tragic cost of that. But even though that's not possible with walking drunk, turns out that there are a lot of ways to die while walking drunk. You walk, you think you can make the light and then you run for it and it's dark. In North Carolina, actually, in the mid-eastern part of the state years ago, there was this weird trend of people just like being out, kind of rural areas and drinking a lot and then lying down in the road to kind of nap, I guess. I'm not quite sure. And that's not a good place to nap, plainly. And so there are a lot of people walk on the side of a road and fall into a ravine. And so if you add all this up, it's much, much, much more dangerous, as it turns out, to walk a mile drunk than to drive a mile drunk. So bottom line, plainly, is friends don't let friends drive drunk, but plainly, they shouldn't let friends walk drunk either. This, again, is how I spend my days, thinking about things like education, right? Education, if you had to spend $1 at the beginning of history on any one investment, education would probably be the single best way to spend that dollar. So it turns out that if you look at stocks, if you look at gold, if you look at buying Manhattan, whatever, in terms of aggregate investment, the single smartest way to spend a dollar is getting more education for yourself or your kids. And it turns out that the more education you get, the higher the ROI is on the education. So post-secondary and beyond is even more. So it's an amazing, it's one of the greatest things about, it's one of the greatest instances of leverage, how you can use leverage to produce a better outcome by buying the right thing or investing in the right thing. So we know this, the returns to education are huge. So whenever you've got a big reward like that, education, I like to also think about, well, if something is really desirable and something's really valuable, what do people do to get it if it's kind of hard to get? Because if you think about it, if you want to go to college and graduate school, maybe even get a PhD, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time, and the opportunity cost is pretty large. What are all the other things you could be doing there? So whenever you've got something valuable, you want to look at how people might be trying to get it, not going through the proper channel, so some form of cheating. So what I wanted to look at was how many people have, or say they have, college degrees, diplomas, that didn't actually do the coursework. So it turns out that this is really fun data to try to find, not so easy, because obviously whenever you're trying to find out something that people are doing wrong, they don't volunteer the information. And the best data source for this that we were able to find was one FBI investigator who got totally obsessed with the idea of fake diplomas. And there are kind of 2 kinds of fake diplomas. There's a diploma mill model where you could take like a correspondence course in, let's say, golf course maintenance. Maybe maintenance is a field you want to go into rather than the actual playing. It's a good option. And but you could like take one correspondence course in something, and then there are places that will turn that into a real degree, a real diploma. And then there's the total counterfeit model, which is you can send off for and with a check for $5,000 and get literally a Harvard MD diploma, okay? So there's counterfeits and diploma mills. And this guy, this investigator, wanted to know how prominent this was, how much of these fakes were in the market. And he especially wanted to know because he, at the time, had 2 daughters. He was actually in North Carolina, too, now that I think about it. One of his daughters was going to Carolina, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And he was looking at the numbers, even as an in-state resident, and thinking, God, if I could just buy a diploma for $4,000 rather than spending 40 or 50 or 60 grand, and my daughter was smart enough, like, wouldn't that be better? So that's kind of, a lot of times the people who go looking for data come at it from some kind of personal interest, and that was his thing too. So anyway, after many, 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 many investigations and arresting a lot of people and finding out a lot of things, how this worked, it turns out that his conclusion was that about 1% of every college diploma given in the US in a given year is totally, totally fake. So 1%. So 1% on its own doesn't sound like a big number, right? But when you think about 1% of the couple 100,000 of diplomas that are awarded every year, so look at it this way. There are about, I don't know, 300-400 people in this room. I'm not pointing fingers, but do the math, okay? If you're in a company with 100 people, the odds are that someone there is not exactly as well educated as you think they are. So this is what I spend my days thinking about. And what all of these stories have in common, I would argue, are two things, is finding data that reflects real behavior in the real world, and particularly understanding the incentives that people respond to. Because in each of those cases, with the turkey breeding, with drunk walking, with fake diplomas, this is all about how people get what they want or need, especially when other people want or need the same things. And that is kind of my favorite definition of economics. I think that makes it a much more human scale endeavor that we can all understand, how people get what they want or need when other people, you could put it another way. You could say it's about the allocation of scarce resources and the proper pricing, incorporating supply and demand. That's all true. But I think for most of us who aren't interested in technical economics, I think it's really useful to think of it as how we all, or how our clients or our customers or our kids or our families or our politicians, whoever, get what they want or need, especially when other people want or need the same things. And that's really the foundation of everything we do in Freakonomics. And so if you want to think like a freak, I'm not saying you necessarily want to, but if you do, these are the things you need to do. Get the data. Work really hard to understand incentives, which is often harder than it seems, and I'm going to tell some stories about that. Be willing to acknowledge what you don't know. I think it's incredibly hard in a lot of business settings, especially when someone proposes a problem or asks a question. It's really hard for smart people to say, I don't know the answer to that, and then, but I'll figure it out. We're really, really, really good at kind of faking it a little bit. And we understand why. There's our reputation. We don't want to seem incompetent or ignorant. But in a lot of cases, if you can acknowledge that you don't know the answer to a question, you'll work much harder and smarter to find data and understand the incentives that help you answer it. So those are the things I want to talk about today. And I'll begin, I guess, with a little experiment. Let me see, by show of hands, raise your hand if you, after you use a public restroom, after you use the toilet in a public restroom, you do not wash your hands, okay? Go ahead, hoist them high. Let's see what we've got here. All right, awesome. Unbelievably hygienic people here. So, all right, so here's what I'm gonna say about that. You, I'm sure, are a pretty trustworthy group of people, honest, because you work in digital marketing. And you look to be very, very hygienic from what I can tell, but I also know that a bunch of you, particularly the men, are lying to me now, okay? And I know you're lying because there's pretty good data on this very topic. It's called public restroom hand hygiene compliance data, okay? Now, if you think about it, if you want data on this, how do you get it? Sometimes when you're trying to get good data in the world, you have to be very crafty, very clever. I mean, one thing that's amazing about what you guys do is that it is just a data harvesting machine, right? Digital anything is just perfect for seeing what people really respond to. And A/B testing or A through Z testing is incredibly useful, and it's incredibly cheap, and it's what you, I'm sure, do all day and should be doing all day because it lets you get real data. But in some cases, it is hard to get the data that reflects real behavior. And in the case of a public restroom, what do you do? You can't put cameras in a public restroom and so on. So sometimes you have to be a little crafty. So here's one way to do it. This is something that I've done to gather data in this realm. I travel a lot. I'm guessing a lot of you do as well. And when I get off an airplane, if I need to use a restroom, I do so. And then I wash my hands. And then at the sink, I'll just kind of linger for a while, and I'll keep washing and keep drying, and I always carry some kind of, writing blah, 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 a notebook or some paper, and I will literally just mark down the number of men who have come out from using the toilet and the share of them that are now washing their hands, okay? So if you find this kind of data collection exciting and fun, give it a try. It's cheap, it's easy. You do not want to try this, however, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, where you may remember a certain US senator was doing a whole different kind of research in the stall, which will get you arrested and you will lose your Senate seat. So don't do that. But what I do is pretty harmless. And what I find is that on average, about 70% of the men who have used a public toilet then wash their hands, and 30% just go right past without. Now, let's put aside for a minute any ideas of the public health concerns. Maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't. We'd have to look at different data to figure that out. But let's just think for a minute. My point is, if you brought the 30% of the non-washers in here and sat them with their friends and colleagues and clients, they're not going to raise their hands either. The circumstances under which you ask a question, and more broadly, more valuably for your purposes and for mine, the circumstances under which data are gathered have a great deal to do with how reliable those data are, okay? So we know that intellectually. We totally understand that. But our brains are great computers, and they're much, much, much better than the best computers at certain things, and they're also much worse at computers at other things. And one thing that we're kind of bad at is when we have a decision that we really want to make, or a project that we really want to greenlight, or an idea that we really want to be true, we're really good at finding data that confirm what we want to be true, and we're really good at not seeking out data that might challenge our belief. So this is kind of, sometimes it's called confirmation bias, and it turns out that the smarter you are, the better you are at seeking out information that confirms your bias or belief or your priors. So there's some really neat research in the realm of hot-button political issues like nuclear power and gun control and different vaccines and things like this. And it turns out that when you talk to people and do these very, very intensive surveys, which can be misleading surveys, but if you do these very intensive surveys, it turns out that the smartest people that you talk to hold the most extreme views on these topics, but not just extreme right, it could be extreme left, which is weird, right? Because we think that if you're smart, you're educated. If you're educated, you take in a lot of information. And what that tends to do, we like to think, is it leads you to hold moderate views. But it turns out it's exactly the opposite, that smarter people hold extreme views. Why? The theory goes that the smarter you are, the better you are at gathering a lot of information, but you tend to gather information that only confirms your pre-existing bias. And so you have all these really, really smart people further educating themselves and strengthening their positions, which only make them dig in their heels even further. So what you want to do is not just look for data that confirms how you already think you should be behaving, and you want to look at the data that reflects the real world as best as you can. So let's say I am a public health official, or let's say I'm running a hospital where and hand hygiene is really important. I don't want to rely on some self-reported survey from a bunch of seemingly honest, seemingly hygienic people who turns out lie to me by the tune of at least 30%, because I'm going to make a bunch of decisions and spend a bunch of resources that won't address the problem. So I have to find good data. So let's say, again, let's say I do care about hand hygiene. Let's say I do run a hospital. How do you find out the real data in that case? So there was a very nice study done in Australia a few years back where the researchers came in. It was a pediatric hospital, okay? And so all these doctors who were treating kids, and they wanted to know their hand hygiene rate in the hospital. And basically, a doctor is essentially supposed to wash his or her hands before and after every significant contact with a patient, okay? Wash or disinfect. So over the course of a few months that the study was going on, they asked every doctor to report to the researchers who were sitting there with clipboards at the end of the day, tell us, how you did today. And the self-reported rate at the end of that period was 73%. So not great, but could have been worse. But here's the thing. During the same period of time that those docs were asked to report their data, the researchers very cleverly had deputized the nurses in the hospital to spy on the doctors and literally keep track of every time a doctor went into a patient's room and see or listen to hear whether they washed or disinfected their hands. And it turns out that during the same exact period of time that those same exact doctors who reported 73%, their actual rate of hand hygiene was 9%, okay? So forget for a minute about how gross and scary and bad that is. just think about this. Anytime you've got a situation where you're gathering data, and in one form of the data, people say they're doing something 3 out of 4 times, and they're actually doing it only 1 out of 10, not only is the magnitude way off, but the nature of the problem may be really different. And this is what economists call declared preferences, what people say they'll do, how they say they will vote or invest their money or spend their money or feel about a particular topic in the future, and revealed preferences, which is what people actually do. So the problem with a lot of data that we collect and analyze and act on is that it's basically declared preferences, what people say they think about something. And what you need to do is get revealed preferences in the data, okay? So that's step one, is try to sort out the good data from the bad data. Once you know that, you can try to address the problem. So let's stick for a little while with this problem of hand hygiene. So it turns out that if you run a hospital, that getting your doctors and nurses and everybody else to keep their hands really clean is super, super important. You can save tons of lives by the simple act of getting people to do like perfect hand hygiene. So if you look at the data on accidental preventable deaths in US hospitals, there are about 100,000 deaths every year in US hospitals from a cause unrelated to the reason the person is in the hospital for in the first place. So think about that, 100,000, triple the number of traffic fatalities, like 6 times the number of homicides, all from people who go to a hospital, the place they go to get well, and then the hospital kills them from an unrelated reason. So that's an unacceptably high number. And the single biggest category of those deaths is bacterial infection. And you can't stop all bacterial infection with great hand hygiene, but it is, again, the cheapest, simplest way to really, really cut down. So what you want to look at is, okay, how is the hand hygiene? If I run a hospital, how is our hand hygiene among our medical professionals? Let's measure that. So one hospital in LA, Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, which is, unbelievably great world-class hospital on just about every dimension. They measured their doctors' hand hygiene. They too deputized their nurses to spy on the doctors. And it turns out that their doctors' hand hygiene was about 60%. So they decided this was just unacceptable. And that as a matter of morality and as a matter of business and as a matter of medicine, they wanted to get it to 100%. So they, the leadership of the hospital kind of got together and they thought, all right, how do we attack this problem? And they came up with a solution that we love to do, particularly in America, particularly in corporate America, because we know it works so incredibly well. So they formed a big committee to fight the problem, okay? And this is called the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center Chief of Staff Hand Hygiene Advisory Committee, okay? It's like Chichasahing for short. And this committee was made up of about 20 of the most senior officials in the hospital, almost all of whom were MDs themselves. So they were very powerful, and they also knew the medicine well, they knew the science well, and they knew the behavior well. They knew how doctors really went through their day. And so they got together at a big committee meeting, and they thought, okay, what's the problem here? Is the problem one of education? Do we need to teach the doctors, what to do? No, the doctors are very well educated. We think it's just a failure of communication. We just need to communicate to the doctors that we expect 100% hand hygiene compliance as a matter of morality and science and blah, blah, blah. So they thought, how can we communicate this message best? And they came up with the kind of solution that, again, in corporate America is often the first step. They decided to write a memo. And they wrote a really tough, strongly worded memo that said, we fully expect and appreciate 100% hand hygiene compliance going forward. Thank you very much, Cedars-Sinai Medical Center Chief of Staff Hand Hygiene Advisory Committee. And now they distributed the memo, and they sat back and they waited for the needle to move. They were still having their nurses spy on the doctors, and the needle doesn't move at all. The memo was just totally, totally ignored, okay? So now the committee says, plainly, we need to think of a different motivation, a different incentive. What if we bring our message to the wards where the doctors are actually visiting patients, because that's where this happens. So they came up with this really cool idea. This was called the, it was like a subdivision of the big committee. This was now, they were breaking into smaller groups called the Posse Patrol Program. So this was now the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center Chief of Staff Hand Hygiene Advisory Committee Posse Patrol Program, or Chichasahing Triple P. And what the Posse Patrol Program would do, it'd be groups of just like 2 or 3 of these committee members, and they would go into patients' rooms when the doctors were expected to come make their rounds, and they would literally hide in the room and wait, like behind a wall or a curtain or a piece of equipment, and they would wait for the doctor to come in and wash or not wash his or her hands. Now, whenever you're coming up with an incentive, there are many varieties of incentive, many flavors. There's financial incentive, but there are social and moral and reputation. There's fear. There are all these different incentives, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But there's also the matter of positive or negative, right? Which is, should it be carrot or should it be stick? And in this case, they're thinking, their initial thought was, when a doctor comes in and doesn't wash, we should jump out and like kind of yell at them and take down their name and post it publicly and shame them. Because that was just like a natural punitive idea. And then they realized that that would be a bad idea, that it would just sour the relationship between the administration and the hospitals. So instead they came up with a positive incentive, a carrot. And so here's the way it would work. The Posse Patrol Program is hiding in a patient's room, very quiet. Then they hear the doctor coming down the hall, and they would wait, and then the doc would come in, and when they would hear the water go on, they would jump out from behind the wall and clap for the doctor, okay? And then they would hand him a $10 Starbucks card as a reward for washing their hands. And when the chief of staff of the hospital told me this story when I was interviewing him, I said to him, you know, Dr. Slavin, you know, you're plainly, you're a brilliant, this guy was a brilliant surgeon, and you're the chief of staff of one of the best hospitals in the world. You're plainly way, way, way smarter than I'll ever be. But that idea just sounds so stupid that you are hoping to change the behavior of the highest earners in your hospital. I mean, these doctors were earning $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a year, and you're hoping to change their behavior with $10 worth of free coffee? That's just absurd. So I learned a really good lesson that day. I was wrong. And the lesson I learned is that you should never underestimate the power of free on anyone, okay? Because it does not matter how much money someone's got or what they make, what they're worth. If you dangle something free in front of them, you know, like I said, the human brain is awesome, but it's also pretty primordial in some parts. And like, if you offer us something free, we just want it. So I don't know what they're giving out at this. I'm sure there are going to be go bags. There's going to be all kinds of free stuff. And I don't mean to offend anyone who's putting the stuff in the bags, but it might be totally worthless stuff. It could be like sweatbands for your pet or something, and you are still going to want it badly. You're going to line up for it because it's free, and you're going to take it home and you're going to put it in your rollerboard even though it makes your bag too crowded because it's free, and you're going to keep it in your closet at home even though you don't want it. Then like 10 years from now you're going to sell it at a yard sale for like 50 cents, and you're going to say, oh, that's great, I made 50, it was free, I got it free. You'll be so excited. That's the way we are with free stuff. And the doctors at Cedars-Sinai loved it. So not a single doctor ever turned down a card. They never said, you know, you're paying me $500,000, so thank you, save your $10. They never said that. Moreover, they began to game the system. When they would hear that the posse was on their floor, they'd run up and start washing their hands in all the rooms trying to get extra cards. So that was great, right? It took literally a life and death problem, and it turned it into a game that people love to play, which is fantastic. The only problem was it didn't work. The long-term, it didn't change the actual hand hygiene behavior over any course of time. Why? It's a little hard to say why. A lot of the stuff that you can tell from data is the what, right? The data tells you what. Understanding the why is really, really hard until we get an RFID chip or some kind of chip that we can put in people's brains and understand why they make every decision, which is a chip I would love to own. I mean, it would be terrible, really. It would be the end of civilization, be the end of privacy, be the end of everything. But that's really the only way you can know how people really, really, really think about making a decision. So the why is hard to figure out often. In this case, you can take some guesses as to the why. If I'm a doc and I wash my hands and I get the $10 card and I stop for 5 minutes and chat with the posse, now I'm 5 minutes behind. And now when I'm on the next floor seeing patients, I got to make up for time. Or maybe if I got the card on the 5th floor, now I'm seeing patients on the 4th floor, I know the posse's not there, and so I'm not going to, I'm going to skip one. But for whatever reason, it didn't change overall hand hygiene. So now the posse's kind of desperate. And at one of the meetings of the big committee, someone speaks up at the meeting who'd never spoken up before, and this was the staff epidemiologist. So her job is to understand basically the way pathogens, the way disease moves through a population, whether it's outside the hospital or within the hospital. And she said, I have an idea. It's not a solution to the problem, really, but it's just an idea that might change the way we think about the problem. And she pulled out a bag with 20 Petri dishes with agar plates in them, the kind of thing you use in biology class to take a sample of something and try to culture it. And she said, here we are, the administration of the hospital, telling everyone else that they're misbehaving, but what about us? Are our hands clean, literally? And so she asked everybody on the committee to lay their palms in the Petri dishes. And she wrapped them up, and she sent them to the lab to be cultured. She anonymized them. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone by identification. And they cultured them, and as it turns out, the vast majority of those hands belonging to the people on the committee were covered with the very bacteria they'd been telling everybody else they were failing to get rid of. And this was a very sobering moment for them. They realized that the scope of the problem was so different that even they were failing. And they thought, what do we do now? Is there any way we can take this experiment, this experience, and turn it into an incentive or a motivation to change behavior? And the chief of staff came up with what turned out to be a brilliant idea. He said, what if we take a photograph of one of these Petri dishes with the palm print? If you're a doctor or a nurse and you see this palm print, it's the shape of a hand, and you see the bacteria that are bright yellow on the background of red, and it's very, very obvious that these are rotten bacteria. And he thought, what if we take a photograph of one of these bacteria and make it the screensaver on every computer in the hospital and let everybody know that it belonged to one of us? And they did it, and overnight, hand hygiene at Cedars-Sinai shot up to 100%. For whatever reason, no one could have predicted that. For whatever reason, that was the incentive that changed people's behavior. And it worked so incredibly well that other hospitals began to hear about it, and they would write and call Cedars-Sinai, and they'd say, hey, can we get a copy of your photograph of the hand bacteria? Because we don't have any bacteria in our hospital, of course, right? So that would seem to be a really great story with a happy ending about how clever people use data and incentives to come up with a way to save lives. And it is, but it's also, to my mind, an illustration of a huge failure and how hard it is just to get people to do the very kind of thing they already knew they should have been doing all along, right? Well-educated, well-motivated people, just getting them to do the thing that they already know is the right thing. So it turns out that when you try to introduce incentives to get people to do the right thing and tell them you should do it because it's the right thing, that is one of the weakest arguments you can actually ever make, which runs really counter to almost everything we're taught as children and as members of a civic society. We really believe that if you tell people that this is the good thing and this is the bad thing, that that's going to be enough motivation for people to do it. And it turns out that's really not true. It's not that there are good people in the world and bad people. It's that there are people, and they respond to whatever the incentives are in place. And often a person who you might consider very, very good, very altruistic, very honest, et cetera, can do something incredibly selfish and greedy if the incentives conspire to encourage that person to do so. And that's what we need to understand better about how incentives work or fail. We often think that because we're smart, motivated people who have some data, that we are really good at coming up with the incentives, with the projects, with the products that people are going to want. One of the flaws in that kind of reasoning is that the smart, motivated, educated, accomplished, successful people who come up with incentives, like you guys, come up with projects, you have a certain way of thinking about the world based on how you would respond to those incentives. And then you build it, and then you unleash it on the world, and it turns out that not everybody thinks like you do. That's what's known as heterogeneous preferences. And that's what makes the world interesting. But it also makes the world a lot harder because people don't respond the way you would. So you need to understand the levers that can be pushed to manipulate people. And when I say manipulate, I don't mean for ill, it could be for good. So let me give you an example of that. Let's pretend that you're a company that makes and sells something, could be anything, and your whole history has been that the more you sell of this thing, the more money you make, right? That's the way most business works. But then all of a sudden, something happens, and there's a weird regulatory wrinkle, and you're going to make more money if you sell less of your product, especially during certain times of the day or certain days of the year. And this is what's happening now in a lot of places with selling electricity, right? So it turns out that if you're a utility company, you make money by people turning on their air conditioning and turning on their refrigerators and the washing machine. And the more that they do that, the more you sell and the more money you make within reason. But because the use of electricity has a lot of what are called negative externalities, right? And negative externality is basically a spillover effect that I can do something and the cost of my action is not paid by me. So if I drive a lot, I pollute a lot more than someone who doesn't drive at all, but I don't really pay any extra. That's a negative externality that the person who doesn't drive at all pays. So with electricity, it's a little bit like that too. If I live next door to you and you use all this electricity and you're burning all this coal somewhere, that's a negative externality that we all pay. So governments in some places, especially California, have decided they want to really cut down on pollution and emissions. And so what they do is they incentivize power companies to get their consumers to use less electricity, especially during the summer, and they'll get paid more the less their customers use. So that's kind of weird, but it's happening more and more. And if you're the company that sells the stuff, you have to think, oh, well, for 100 years, we've been trying to teach people to use as much of our product as possible. Now, how do we get them to use less of our product, at least in certain times of the year? So it's kind of a fun problem to solve. How do you go about solving this problem? Here's one good way, is to, rather than make it a big abstract thing, make it really concrete. Come up with one action that represents the problem you're trying to solve. So in this case, this power company, which was in San Diego, said, let's focus the action on using ceiling fans in summer instead of air conditioning. Air conditioning uses a whole lot of electricity. Ceiling fans use very little, and they kind of perform the same function. So they thought, OK, we would like to know how to get our customers to use more ceiling fans in the summer. Why don't we first ask them what would make them do that more? And so they hooked up with some academic researchers, and they designed a telephone survey. And the way the survey went is they would call up about 1,000 households, and they came up with a menu of 4 kind of reasons or incentives to use fans versus air conditioning. And they asked each person on the other end of the phone to rank them. They said, rank these in order of importance of what would make you use ceiling fans more this summer. Okay? Number 1, it will burn less coal somewhere, and therefore it's good for the environment right now. Pollutes less. Okay? Number 1. Number 2, it will conserve resources for future generations. Right? So numbers 1 and 2 are kind of like sort of like moral or social incentives, right? Number 3 was a financial incentive. It said if you use ceiling fans more, you'll save about $30 a month on the average electricity bill. And number 4 was an incentive. It wasn't even an incentive. It said you could consider using ceiling fans more because other people in your neighborhood will probably think about doing this also. So it's like, I guess you'd call it like a herd mentality incentive or a peer pressure incentive, right? So those are the 4 choices. Pollute less, conserve resources, save money, and do what everybody else is doing, and rank them. So 1,000 households, you can probably figure out how people ranked them. Not that surprising. The vast majority of people said numbers 1 or 2, right? I want to do what's the right thing, what's the good thing, pollute less, save energy. Some people ranked the financial incentive as their number 1 reason, and nobody said, I want to be part of the herd that's going to use fans because other people are doing it, right? Because we don't think of ourselves as herd animals at all. We think of ourselves as making up our own minds about decisions based on what we know to be worthwhile and true. So that's the declared preferences. That's the data that shows very plainly what people say will make them behave in a certain way. But
because there were academic researchers attached to this project, they knew that you can't just rely on what people say. If you did rely on just what people say, and you're that utility, you would immediately take out all these billboards and do all this messaging about you should use fans more this summer because it's good for the environment and so on, right? That's how you'd want to spend your money, because you would know that it would work based on the data that you gathered. But they decided to gather some data on real electricity use and as it related to those messages. So this was very simple but very clever. They designed this experiment so they would now, they knew what people said, they would go out into the field and they would go into these different neighborhoods and they would hang signs on people's doors. They literally would walk up to people's front doors and hang a sign on it that said, from the power company, we would like to encourage you to use more ceiling fans this summer instead of air conditioning because X. And there were 4 versions of the X, so it was randomized, right? They did a real randomized controlled trial. And they would hang the signs, and the 4 X versions were correlated, were parallel to the 4 reasons that they'd done in the phone survey. So one version said you should use ceiling fans more because it burns less coal. Another one said because it's good for future generations, and so on, all the way down to the herd mentality. And they randomly distributed them, and now they could measure the actual energy usage in each home and relate it to which of those 4 door hangers that home got. And that would be a really nice way to look at the revealed preferences, what people actually did. So you let them go on for a few months, you see what the energy usage does, and then you measure. So as it turns out, if you live in a home and you got the sign that said you should use fans more this summer because it's good for the environment and it's the right thing to do, it turns out that on average you would use a little bit more electricity than the other people around you. So it turns out that the moral and social incentives totally failed. And if you look at the literature on these kind of incentives generally, they often totally fail. So like the Partnership for a Drug-Free America is a famous example. They spent, I think, a couple $1 billion basically telling people that doing drugs is a really scary thing and it's really bad for you. The problem with that kind of message is apparently people just generally don't like to be preached to very much, but also it's the kind of message that the kind of people who aren't really going to do drugs anyway will see that and say, oh yeah, that's exactly why I don't do drugs. And the people who really want to do drugs, that message just doesn't work on them. And that was the way it was with the social and moral messaging for the electricity usage as well. If you live in a home where you got the financial incentive message, where it would say you can save $30 a month on your electricity bill, it turns out that you too would use slightly more electricity than you had the previous summer or than people around you. Why? Economists are always saying that financial incentives are the most powerful and they change behavior. And that may be true, but scale really matters with financial incentives. So there are a lot of things that you would never do for $100 that you would do for $1 million. I don't know personally for you what those things are, but you know what your own list is. So for financial incentives, scale is really, really important. And as it turns out, if you think about, if I get the sign that says I'm going to save $30 a month on my power bill, just think about how you do that actual calculation when you're hot, right? You come home from work one day and you're hot and you sit in your chair and there's the ceiling fan and there's the switch for the air conditioner. Maybe I even have a remote for the air conditioner. And I think about the message and it said $30 a month. And today is one day, so that's $1 today. So like it costs me $1 to get cool like immediately. Bam, I'm always going to hit the switch on the air conditioner. If that's the only barrier keeping me from doing that, $1 is just not high enough. If it was $100 a day, that would change behavior, but it didn't. The only one that changed behavior was the sign that said other people in your neighborhood are thinking about using ceiling fans more this summer. And for reasons that, again, I certainly wouldn't have predicted, and I don't think anybody would have predicted, the herd mentality incentive was the one that made people change their behavior. You can look at this data, as I did first, and think, that's kind of depressing to think that, we like to think that we make our decisions for really good reasons, not just following what other people do. And I don't like feeling that I'm just part of a herd. On the other hand, if you want to do well in the world, whether in your firm, in your politics, in society, it's good to know what really works. And if you know that what really works is people seeing other people doing the thing that is right, whether or not, because it's right, that's a great way to get them to do it. Now, you don't get to that kind of result unless you're willing to experiment. So I think that one thing that I would encourage you all to do even more if you do it a lot is just experiment every day. One of the, in science, experimentation is the benchmark. That's how we figure out stuff. You have an idea, you have a thesis, and you come up with a way to test it reputably, to randomize it, especially if it involves people, and then to measure the results. And you have to understand that most of the experiments that you do are going to be partial or complete failures. And failure is great. Failure is information. The problem is, in a lot of firms where our reputations are built on competence, we don't like to, as I said before, admit that we don't know the answer already. And in order to experiment, you kind of have to be willing to admit you don't know. You have to kind of say, like, we have this new idea, and we'd like to try it out, and we think it's a good idea, but we don't know. So the best way we're going to try it out to see if it's worthwhile is to set up an experiment where we can really randomize it, where we can really have a control group and enough other groups to see what the effect is, and then come up with some data that tells us the real answer. And that takes a certain amount of courage. And I love people who have the courage to not only do those kind of experiments, but also, I think this is the last thing that I would encourage you to really do in your work and in your personal lives as well, is to be willing to ask questions that don't seem obviously smart or sophisticated or even related necessarily to the question at hand, to the problem at hand. And this is the one component of what we do that I think is really, fun and pretty effective, and it's kind of what we call thinking like a child. So children are really good and natural at asking a lot of questions. All they're doing is really trying to figure out the way the world works. And it's kind of weird and complicated, and they have huge information asymmetries, it's called. We know so much more about the world than kids, and yet, in part because kids don't have all our experience, they'll sometimes ask a question that gets right to the root of it, right? And then we, as adults, we kind of get that conditioned out of us, that desire and ability to ask those ridiculous questions. Like, everybody, I don't know about everybody, I've been in those meetings where the boss will say, okay, we have a real situation here, we got a real problem, or we really need a good idea, and we're going to brainstorm, and there's no such thing as a stupid idea, right? I remember this distinctly. I was working at the New York Times, and we had a little crisis, and the editor-in-chief said this. And there was this idea that I'd had for like 5 or 6 months, and I was just embarrassed to raise it. And then I thought, this is my opening. He said, there's literally no such thing as a stupid idea. So I raised my hand and I say my idea. And he said, okay, I want to amend that. There is such a thing as a stupid idea. That was one, but we still need to brainstorm. So after that happens to you, it's very natural that you'll stop with those kind of ideas. No one wants to be ridiculed and laughed at and penalized for having kind of childlike ideas. But there are some people who have the courage to just do it and to keep going. And I want to tell you one more story about someone who did that and did it in an experimental form, and it worked out pretty well for him. So this is about a guy named Keith Chen, who at the time that the story begins was a young, untenured economist at Yale. He was an associate professor of economics at Yale. So he shows up, he's got a teaching load, but really what he's trying to do now is find an area of research that he can do so well that he's going to win tenure. And the way you do that is by coming up typically with one research question and go really, really, really deep and get some good data and publish your findings in a bunch of papers and have all your peers and elders think that you're really worth keeping around and that they'll offer you tenure. So here's the research question Keith Chen had been working on. He's really, really neat, super verbal, thoughtful, interesting, culturally aware guy, especially for an economist. He wasn't super, super mathy the way a lot of economists were. And he was an immigrant here, and he grew up in the Midwest US, and then he went to school in California and ended up on the East Coast. And before he'd become an economist, he was a Marxist, a full-blown Marxist, like in high school. So he was really interested, going from Marxist to economist, he was really interested in the basics of money and how people think about money and how they think about all their decisions, spending, saving, borrowing, stealing, whatever. And the weird thing is, when you look at the economics literature, you would think that economics would be, like, they would have figured out everything about how people think about money, but it turns out that they haven't. That, like, thinking about how people think about money is considered just too, like, everyday for most super smart economists. They want to work on much bigger problems. So, and it's also hard, right? Because people will say one thing about money and then do another. They might say that they're very altruistic or whatever, but they might not be so altruistic. So Keith Chen thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could design an experimental economy where I could control every dollar that was spent and write down how it was all spent and analyze it and come up with some really great insights into how we think about money. So that was basically his idea. But then the more you look at the literature, the more you see that, well, the problem is that, like I just said, people will say one thing and then do another when it comes to money, right? So I used to write about crime a lot when I first moved to New York, and I remember this one detective told me that when you start to investigate something, someone's done something bad or someone's gotten killed or killed somebody else, that everybody's lying all the time, even the people associated with the victim in a lot of crimes, in part because it's never as clear-cut as they'd like it to be, in part because people are so traumatized. And he said it's really just hard to figure out the basics of who went where and did what and why and how. And he said the single best thing I could know is if I could know how every person involved spent their every dollar, I could really tell what they're all about. And that was kind of what Keith Chen came up against. He thought, if I could tell how people spend their every dollar, that would be great, because what people do with money is they express their preferences with money, right? So again, I might say I'm very altruistic, but if you could see how I spend my every dollar, you could see whether that's really true. I might say that I love high art and culture, but if you can see that I actually spend a lot more money on, video games or golf, whatever, then you could know where the truth is. So Keith Chen was thinking about all this and thinking that, well, it'd be great if I could have an experimental economy and learn that, but because people are not so forthright, because they'll often say what a researcher wants to hear or whatnot, that I don't think it'll work. So he thought, what if I could do an experimental economy about how people spend money, but leave human beings out of it? And instead, he thought, what if I come up with an experimental economy, and instead of people, I use monkeys? Right? Because they're kind of like people. And he thought, wouldn't that be awesome if I could set up an experimental monkey economy? So academia being what it is, you can get away with ideas like this, right? And you can actually do it. And so he began the process of setting up this monkey lab at Yale New Haven Hospital. And when his elders at Yale, these economists who are incredibly brilliant, many of them have won big awards. They work on big macroeconomic issues. They're consulting to foreign governments and so on. And they'd say to him, Keith, what's your research question going to be here at Yale? And he'd say, oh, I'm going to be doing some currency experiments. So he would never say the word monkey to any of them because, economists don't do monkey experiments. But he thought this would be a really cool way of finding out if there were any parallels at all between monkeys and us, he thought, any at all, then he could extrapolate from that and get a bunch of papers and maybe win tenure. So that's his goal. All right, so how do you set up an experimental monkey economy? So here's the way this works. Yale New Haven Hospital, like I said, is where it happened. And he set up a big cage where the monkeys would live. There would be 7 monkeys in the cage. And the cage is about maybe the length of this riser that I'm standing on. So picture that going out this way. And then down at the end of the cage, right here, there'd be a little door where one monkey at a time could come in, and there'd be a little cage right here where one monkey could sit, and you could do experiments with one monkey at a time, which is not, by the way, what he originally envisioned was just a big cage with a bunch of monkeys and give them money, teach them how to use money, and then just literally watch them. Keep cameras on, watch every penny. They're buying, selling, trading, da-da-da. And that's what he originally wanted to do. But the people who had to give approval for the experiment, because there's institutional review boards and things like that, animal welfare people, and they said that he was not allowed to just give the monkeys money in here where they live, because they said that would pollute the monkey's natural culture. It would change them too much, and that's not acceptable for academic research. I should just say that on the other side of this wall where his lab is, literally right over there is another monkey lab at the hospital where they're raising monkeys, very similar to the monkeys he would use. They're raising them to be test subjects in brain tumor surgery. So they're literally growing monkeys to operate on their brains, and this is a one-way fatal surgery, okay? So basically the message from the people overseeing the experiment were, it is okay to raise and kill a monkey for medicine, but you cannot give a monkey money, because that's incredibly dangerous, okay? So that's the limitation he's got, but it's an experiment, and he figures, I'm gonna take what I can get. And so he begins to set up this monkey economy where all the monkeys will live down here, but he can only give them money one at a time in the little experimental cage down here. So that's what he takes. There are 7 monkeys, like I said, and he used the capuchin monkey as his subject. I don't know if any of you have ever gotten to hang out with a capuchin. They're really great, yeah? So they're little, like, scrawny, they're like the size of like a scrawny 1-year-old child with a tail the length of the body. And they have very, very nimble fingers. So sometimes they're trained to be help for elderly people opening pill bottles and stuff. They're really nimble like that, and very, very sweet disposition. And there are a couple important things to know about the capuchin monkey. The first is that they are sugar fiends, okay? So if we brought one capuchin monkey into this room and a big vat of something really sweet up here, like imagine like marshmallow fluff, right? The monkey would jump up on the vat and eat like its body weight in fluff. And then it would stagger off into the corner and get really, really ill, okay? But here's the beautiful part. Then he would stagger back to the vat and start eating again, which, if you're an economist, makes him an excellent research subject, okay? Not that they're going to abuse the monkeys in any way. They wouldn't be allowed to. But it's good to know that they really, really want what you have in abundance, right? Which is sweet food. So they love the sweet food. And the other thing to know about the capuchin is that they're not a very smart monkey, okay? So they're nothing like a chimpanzee or some of the other smarter monkeys. In fact, they have a very small and very rudimentary brain, which, by the way, is exactly why he picked that monkey. He doesn't want to know like what a smart monkey can kind of learn to do with money and kind of manipulate the answers the way that humans do. He wants to just see what the monkey brain is hardwired to do with money. And if there are any parallels between them and us, then he's in business. But there was no guarantee there would be. There was no guarantee they could even learn to use money because they have such tiny brains, like I said. And they're not even really thought to think. They're just kind of thought to respond and to act, you know. If they were thought to think, it would be primarily just about 2 things. One is how to get food, particularly sweet food, like I said. And the other is how to get sex. So they're, which you could argue doesn't make them that different from a lot of people that you and I both know, right? And so these tiny food and sex-obsessed monkeys, now you need to teach them how to use money and see how that works. So, okay, how do you teach them how to use money? Here's the way it happens. The monkeys in this lab, they named them all after characters in James Bond films. You'll see that in monkey labs, they usually give them some kind of naming convention. It might be baseball players or musicians. In this case, they were Bond characters. So there's like a 007 capuchin, and there's a Goldfinger. And the one who turned out to be Keith Chen's favorite was named Felix, after the CIA agent Felix Leiter, okay? So here's the way it works. You bring Felix from the big cage here through the door into the little cage, and you give Felix a coin. And they would use washers from a hardware store. You give him a coin, and he'd sniff it and try to eat it. And when he'd see that it's not edible, he'd get rid of it right away. And if you did it repeatedly, he'd get really upset. So then you'd give him the coin, and you'd offer some sweet food. They used Jell-O cubes and grapes and slices of apple and so on. And then Felix would grab the food, and then you would take the coin out of his other hand. And like I said, they're not very smart, these monkeys. It took, on average, 6 months for the 7 monkeys to learn that if you give a coin, you get food in return. But ultimately, they were able to learn that the coin gets you food, okay? So now after 6 months, he's got them doing that. And now he can do some experiments to see how the monkeys use their money to buy stuff. And if they can express their preferences with money the way people do, because that's really what he's after. So sets up a very beautiful, simple experiment. The way this works is you bring each monkey one at a time into the crate, and you have a researcher, two different researchers, one standing on either side of the cage down here, offering different kinds of food. And they're priced the same. For 1 coin, you get a little bowl of food, and the amount of food is always exactly the same. What they're trying to do is see, can these tiny-brained monkeys consistently express preferences for a particular food using money? In other words, do the monkeys even have different preferences? Do they all like the same foods? Do some of them like different foods? How do you know? You're going to experiment. So as it turns out, much to Keith Chen's delight, the monkeys did consistently express their preferences with food. So Felix, for instance, loved Jell-O. And whenever there was Jell-O for sale, he would always buy the Jell-O instead of the grapes or apples or whatever. And the other monkeys, too, had preferences for other foods that they consistently expressed. Now, if there's no Jell-O for sale one day, Felix is still going to buy the other food because, you know, he's a monkey and it's food, and it's not like he's working for the money, and he can't like put it in his pocket and keep it till tomorrow till there's Jell-O. He doesn't have that ability. He can't keep it till the next day. So he's still going to buy the other food, but whenever there's Jell-O for sale, he always buys that. And the other monkeys too consistently buy the foods that they like. So now Keith Chen is thinking, oh man, this is awesome. I am going to get so many papers out of just the consistently expressing preferences with money part of my experiments. But now, being an economist, he wants to push it further. And what he wants to do now is he wants to see how a tiny-brained, food and sex-obsessed monkey responds to price shocks and wealth shocks, okay? Because if you're a person, if you're a rational person operating under the rules that economists have drawn up, you know, when something gets a lot more expensive, you typically, not always, but typically would buy less of it until it becomes a luxury good, and at which point you want to buy more of it, which is a weird thing, but that's the way we are. So he thinks, what would happen if we could take, now that we know each monkey's favorite food, what if we double the price of just that food and leave all the other prices the same? Which is kind of mean to the monkeys because they figured out how to get their favorite food, but in the interest of science. So for Felix, for instance, he comes in one day and all of a sudden the price of Jell-O is doubled and all the other prices are the same. By the way, it's hard to double the price for a monkey because they're so used to giving 1 coin that you can't like wait for them to give a second coin, and if you try to grab it, they get really mad. So the way they had to do it was they had to halve the quantity. So instead of like 2 cubes of Jell-O in the bowl, they have the quantity to 1. So for the monkeys that like grapes, instead of 2, they would get 1. And so by doing that, they wanted to see if you double the price of their favorite food only, what do they do? So again, tiny brain, you would think that they're nothing like us. You would think that they would just keep buying the food that they love. But instead, the monkeys responded rationally to price shocks and then later wealth shocks, which is to say that when the price of their favorite food doubled, they started to buy much, much less of that food and much more of the other foods. So now Keith Chen is saying, this is great because the monkeys are acting a lot like people. They're consistently expressing their preferences with money. They're responding rationally to price shocks. They're responding rationally to wealth shocks. They responded to loss aversion the way that human beings do. It was unbelievable. And so this was great, great news for him. And if he ever needed further evidence of the parallels between the monkeys and us, he got it one day in the lab when something truly unpredictable happened. They've been doing these experiments like thousands of times by now. And on this day, for whatever reason, Felix comes in from the big cage into the little cage, and by now they would usually give each monkey a little basket with 12 coins in it. And the monkey would gather up the coins and start to buy food out of either side of the cage. But on this day, for whatever reason, Felix takes the basket of coins and flings the money back here into the big cage and then runs in after it. So it's like a bank heist over here, followed by a jailbreak into the big cage, okay? And in the big cage now, you can imagine it's total chaos because there are 7 monkeys and there are 12 coins on the ground. And the monkeys have learned that the coins are worth having, so they run in, they're darting after the money. And now Keith Chen, remember, he's not allowed for the monkeys to have the money in there, so he's got to run in and get the money from them. And he goes in and the monkeys will not give him the money because they've learned that the money is valuable. So he goes out and gets the big vats, the big buckets of food to bring it in to bribe the monkeys. And now the monkeys are thinking, oh, whenever possible, we should steal this money because now the nice man in the white lab coat is offering this food. And the exchange rate now is huge. They're getting like big handfuls of food just to give him 1 coin back, right? And then out of the corner of his eye, Keith Chen sees one monkey who's still got a coin, hops over to a second monkey and just gives the second monkey the coin. And as an economist, he's thinking, oh man, that is so interesting. What am I seeing? Is it monkey altruism? Is it the repayment of a monkey loan? You know, what is it? But it was neither of those. There's a couple seconds of like grooming, and then bam, it's monkey sex. I'm not kidding, this is true. It was the first recorded instance of monkey prostitution in the history of monkey science, right? Of monkey experiments. I mean, talk about expressing your preferences with money. That's what was happening. And then after the sex was over, which is like 8 seconds, they're monkeys, right? After the sex is over, the monkey who'd gotten the coin for sex hops over to Keith Chen and gets a big handful of grapes for it. I'm sure if there'd been a cigarette machine in the cage, he would have gone for that instead. So that concludes whatever just happened here. I tried to warn you earlier. I thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. I'll see you later. Thank you. Thank you.